Hello again, and welcome back to another lecture. Now, this one's from Chapter 7 on the skeletal system, so let's get started. First of all, your skeleton. It is made up of more than just plain bone. In fact, it's made up of three major connective tissue types. You've got bone, but you also have cartilage and ligaments. Ligaments are a dense, regular fibrous connective tissue, helping to hold bone to bone. They're very similar to tendons. Tendons are there to hold muscle to bone instead. Okay? But still, obviously the bones are going to be the biggest part of the entire skeletal system, but it's just not those tissues alone. The osseous tissue and the cartilaginous tissue and the fibrous connective tissue, all those are required to make the entire system. Now, what do you do with it? You have these following functions for your skeletal system. Support. It's a set that is going to suspend the rest of your tissues. Holds up body, supports muscles, mandible, maxilla, supports your teeth. Even some of your organs are suspended internally from the inside of your rib cage. Okay? Second, protection. Now, on answers of quizzes, I prefer that people say protection from what. If you just say protection, that doesn't necessarily say what you're being protected against. Is it bears? Is it bad feelings? Is it knives? Is it fire? Is it radiation? Bones, they're particularly good at protecting you from impact damage, right? As opposed to, say, bacteria. It's not particularly important, useful when it comes to stopping bacteria, although true inside where a lot of your white blood cells are going to be created. Nonetheless, bones are primarily there for protection from impact damage. Third, movement. The bones don't move, but the muscles attached to the bones. That's why they're called skeletal muscles. And those muscles now gain leverage on the bones, so they can provide greater force against various resistances. Fourth, electrolyte balance. Your bones are made up of minerals, primarily calcium, but also, to a small degree, things like magnesium and phosphorus and other electrolytes. But the main ones that we save there are calcium and phosphate ions, right? And they can be taken off of the bone by utilizing cells that dissolve bone tissue, like osteoclasts. Right? So if you need to, you can get extra calcium from your bone and put it into your tissue fluid and your bloodstream. And we need those kinds of ions for things like muscle contraction and nervous function. If we have too low a level of those elements in the bloodstream, then those electrically active organ systems don't work as well. Then, acid-base balance. Your bone, both the mineral portion as well as the collagenous portion, have the ability to buffer blood against excessive pH changes, which means it can go in either direction. If your blood were to become too acidic, then that means that the bone tissue is able to take up some of those free hydrogen ions and take them out of the tissue fluid, which makes it less acidic. And if it were to become too basic, then the bones and tissues, our skeletal tissues, are capable of releasing hydrogen ions, so as to go from being more alkaline towards being more the appropriate pH value. So no matter which way your pH is changing, acidic or basic, your bones are going to help to resist that change. And finally, bone formation. Inside of numerous of your bones, there's going to be red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is a place where your red blood cells get made, and also your white blood cells and the platelets. Pretty much all the formed elements of your blood are formed in your red bone marrow. Okay? So 6 functions: support, protection from impact, movement, electrolyte balance, acid-base balance, and blood formation. Alright, and so now, as we go from here to the shapes of bones. Nope, not one. Here we go. Okay. All the bones that you've got can be put into 4 major categories. You've got flat bones, like your parietal bone, which is the one here on the side of your skull, but also that includes things like your ribs and your scapula bones and your sternum. All of those usually have compact bone on one side, then a layer of spongy bone, then another layer of compact bone on the inside, like sandwich-like, right? And these are some of the ones that are particularly good at protecting one from impact damage. Right? So flat bones is just your first bone category type. Then we also have your long bones, short bones, and irregular bones. Now, long bones are clearly longer than they are wide. But another key feature is that long bones are going to have enlarged ends. Now those things are called the epiphyses. Okay. Whereas the shaft section here, typical of a long bone, is called a diaphysis. Right? So 2 epiphyses and 1 diaphysis. This includes things like the bones that are in your fingers, the bones that are in your palm. Not the ones in the wrist. Those are those belong to the short type. But the bones in your forearm, your upper arm, and similar pattern in your legs, your toes, your arch, your shin bones, and your thigh bones, all those things count as long bones. Even the tiny ones that are here at the very ends of your fingers and your pinky toe, those are still considered to be long bones because they have at least 1 epiphysis and a diaphysis in the center portion. Good. These are the ones that typically are going to be serving as levers for movement. Then you have your short bones. Short bones are usually about the same height as width, more or less. And the most common ones are the ones in the wrists called carpals, the ones in your ankles that are called tarsals, and your kneecap also called the patella. All those belong to the short bone set. Okay. And then finally, you have your irregular bones. Irregular bones basically just don't fall into the other categories. And they also tend to have numerous spiky projections sticking out of them. So let's see. There's your sacrum, there's your vertebra, there's your ethmoid bone in your skull, your sphenoid bone in your skull. So another one of the irregular coccyx at the very end of the spinal column. All those count as the irregular type, basically if it doesn't fit into the other 3 categories. Right? Now then, no matter which bone type you've got, there are some components that are going to be consistent amongst all of them. However, very often we do use the long bone as a sort of standard bone to describe a number of these structures. For example, bone can be divided up into spongy bone and compact bone. Now they're both made of the same osseous tissue, which is for the most part calcium crystals wrapped around collagen fibers. But you can now describe them a little bit further in terms of compact bone versus spongy bone. Spongy bone is the stuff that looks like sponge, but is still hard to the touch. Compact bone appears to be the smooth material that's found on the surfaces of all bones. There should be no exposed spongy bone on any bone organ that you come across. All the bone on the surface should be compact. You would have to actually carve into it to find the spongy stuff. Okay? Now in the long bone, there are places, like in the diaphysis, where there is no spongy bone, and that area is called the medullary cavity, like the medulla that you found in the inside of a hair. Right? And in there you're going to be finding yellow bone marrow, which is mostly adipose tissue. See, at the ends of your long bone, the central space is occupied by spongy bone, and the ends are usually enlarged epiphyses with a narrow diaphysis shaft. Let's see. Where one bone is going to meet with another one is where you're going to find a layer of hyaline cartilage. Admittedly, it's not hyaline in every last example. For example, your intervertebral discs of your spine have fibrocartilage in there instead. But generally, where you're going to have a mobile joint, like say a synovial joint, that's where you're going to find hyaline cartilage to create a smooth surface so that one bone can move against one another without too much friction damage. Right. Blood vessels are capable of getting into bone through the surface at little openings that are called nutrient foramina. And then once you get past that nutrient foramina, that's where you see the blood vessels will then penetrate further into the compact bone, joining with the many canals in the middle of osteons. And those blood vessels will continue to progress all the way through the compact bone and into the spongy bone interior. So bone tissue is surprisingly vascular. It's got a lot of blood running through it and a lot of fluid in between the cells, going from one little cell's chamber to the next one. Alright, but on the outside, as you can see right here, there's a layer of fibrous connective tissue that is attached to the outside of every bone, flat, short, long, irregular, and so forth, wherever it's not covered with cartilage. And that is called the periosteum. The periosteum is dense, irregular, fibrous connective tissue, and has 2 layers to it. What's being peeled away here in this image, right here, what's being peeled away here in this image is the fibrous layer of the periosteum. Okay? Then, underneath that is where you would find your osteogenic layer. Lots and lots of tiny little cells, osteogenic cells, that are capable of differentiating into osteoblasts and chondroblasts and fibroblasts. But the protein fibrous portion of the periosteum is permanently affixed to the surface of the bone. Well, permanently unless someone decides to actually go through the effort of trying to remove it. But under normal circumstances, it's stuck there on the surface because some of the protein fibers that make up its matrix embed themselves deeper into the bone matrix. Okay? And those protein fibers that do this are called perforating fibers or Sharpie fibers. Okay? But this is what's going to make sure that the periosteum stays attached to the bone. You could denature those proteins with heat or pH, in which case you could peel the periosteum from the bone surface, but under normal circumstances it's enmeshed into the bone matrix, so you can't peel it at all. And this is why, if you now need to attach something like a ligament or a tendon, the protein fibers of that structure would then weave themselves into the periosteum layer, like threads of a carpet. And since the periosteum has its Sharpie fibers extending into the bone, then it's very, very difficult to tear a tendon or ligament away from the periosteum, because it's a continuum of woven protein fibers into other woven protein fibers, which are then embedded into the hard matrix of the bone. Okay? So in other words, it's a pretty tricky thing to actually tear a ligament or tendon away from the bone to which it is attached. Okay? Now, the periosteum, which translates to around bone, because peri indicates around, osteo for bone, has its counterpart here on the insides of the bone. Wherever you find spongy bone, or where you find a medullary cavity, that's where there's going to be a layer of reticular tissue, which is loose connective tissue. And so all these surfaces have that endosteum tissue on the inside. The endosteum is also loaded up with osteogenic cells. So if ever you need to grow new bone, the cells responsible for that are going to be found on all surfaces, both external surfaces under the periosteum, but also on internal surfaces under the endosteum. And that endosteum even extends all the way into places like this, in the places where you have the central canals or the perforating canals of the vascular system of the bone. Okay. But those are the general features of most bones. Now, one extra added component, let's see, switch to this. That out. Right. Nope, wrong one. Okay. Spongy bone that is layered in between two sheets of compact bone, typical of a flat bone. That part right there is called diploe, D-I-P-L-O-E, right? And is one of those things that is capable of absorbing extra shock from impact damage. Because a person could take a blow to the skull, and that blow could potentially fracture the outer compact bone layer, and then crush, to a certain degree, the spongy bone on the inside. But the impact might not fracture the inner compact bone layer. And this means this is actually serving as a cushion, in particular to protect our very, very important brains. So the flat bones that we've got usually are found creating cages or shells around some of our softer organs. And so the diploe in there really seems to be an adaptation towards protection from impact. Alright, so now, so we've taken care of most of the structures that you can see with the naked eye. Now we go to the smaller scale and take a look at the individual cells. So those osteogenic cells, the ones that are capable of developing any of the tissue that's part of your skeletal system, they start off as little ovoid cells. Right? They're not epithelial cells, so they don't have to be square, squamous, or cubic, columnar, or squamous. But they're like little amoeba. However, there's a layer of them underneath the endosteum and periosteum. When they get the right chemical triggers, then they will differentiate and start following along a developmental pathway, which leads them to become the blast type of cells. So, given the right hormone, an osteogenic cell can become an osteoblast. Given a different hormone, it could become a chondroblast to grow cartilage, or it could become a fibroblast to grow protein fibers, like FCT. But here, in this image, we're looking at the development of the bone developing pathway. So your osteogenic cell transforms into an osteoblast. Inside that osteoblast, you will find a lot of rough endoplasmic reticulum, which is the organelle that is capable of making lipids, true, but it's rough because it's covered with loads and loads of ribosomes, and ribosomes are there to make protein. Right? This is really the primary job of your osteoblast, to synthesize collagen proteins and then release them into the tissue surrounding itself. And those protein fibers accumulate and form a soft collagenous tissue that is called osteoid tissue. That osteoid tissue surrounds and traps the osteoblast that made it. And then eventually the process of calcification occurs, where calcium crystals will now start to adhere to all of those osteoid tissue fibers, in which case it becomes solid bone. After it calcifies. And when that occurs, when the calcification finishes itself, then your osteoblast is completely trapped within the matrix that it made. Your osteoblast then goes through its final transformation, is now an osteocyte, a mature bone cell. It's not dead, it's just inert. It's not doing a lot, it's not adding to the tissue anymore because there's no room for it to grow stuff, it's trapped in its own matrix. But it still can communicate with other cells. All these little fibers that you see sort of sticking out from the eye-like cell surface, those are just extensions of its plasma membrane, like a tendril. But those little extensions of the membrane can now run from one cell to the next, let's mark that out, through the little fissures that are running through the bone matrix. So a line like this one, that's going between one cell and another, residing in a different space, those little canals are called canaliculi. The chamber that the cell is in is called the lacuna. Right? So the lacuna is this space right here. But the canaliculi is the fissure in the bone matrix that will allow one of these cell projections to communicate with another cell in a different lacuna. Right? So going back to one of the previous images, again. Here's what I was talking about. Here's your osteocyte, right, stuck inside of its lacuna. And as you can see, the osteocyte is pretty much the same size as the lacuna it sits in, like a hand inside of a glove. But now the fingers, in this analogy, are extending through the canaliculi to come in contact with cells in other canaliculi. Now, bone cells don't have to touch other bone cells, but they might, which is why we do consider bone to be a kind of connected tissue. But right here, here's one osteocyte, and all these little dark lines that are extending from it, those are the canaliculi that contain the tendrils of the cell that may now be able to communicate with another cell. And not only that, fluid that's found here in the central canal can now flow from this space out to any cell via those canaliculi to bring nutrients to the cells and also to take waste from the cells. Okay, so getting back to the pathway. Your bone-creating cells are the osteogenic cells. They can become osteoblasts, which are capable of making osteoid tissue, which is a collagenous mixture of a mixture of collagenous fibers, right? And then after that, oops, here we go. After it makes the fibers, then the osteoid tissue calcifies and becomes solid bone, and your osteoblast becomes an osteocyte, which can still communicate with other cells by having grown tendrils into the canaliculi, the little canals. Okay, so there's a fourth cell type that you're going to find in bone tissue, and it's this one, the osteoclast. Now, blast builds bone. Osteoclast dissolves bone matrix. They don't come from the same cells that osteogenic cells did. Osteogenic cells came from Osteoblasts came from osteogenic cells. osteoclasts don't come from osteogenic cells. They come from a series of stem cells that are found in bone marrow. But then these cells fuse together to become one massive cell. The size difference is this. Here is a single osteocyte, right? And remember their size, but here is the entire osteoclast. It's a massive cell compared to a single osteocyte. So, and you can see the multiple nuclei there, and there. Those are things that used to be inside of separate cells. So that gives you an idea of just the size of this thing. But what it grows is a ruffled border on its deep side. That ruffled border is made up of a bunch of microvilli, which allow for better, faster absorption and secretion. Well, in this case, it's secreting. What it's secreting is hydrochloric acid. That hydrochloric acid that's released from these microvilli now can dissolve bone matrix and create an indentation in the bone surface, called a resorption bay. So you can find osteoclasts pretty much the same places that you can find osteogenic cells, meaning they're going to be on every bony surface. They will be underneath the periosteum. They will be underneath the endosteum, but they won't be there in the same number as the osteogenic cells. Osteogenic cells are multiplying constantly, and that's appropriate because when they become osteoblasts, osteogenic cells stop reproducing. Your osteoblast is now pretty much dedicated to doing one thing, making the osteotissue and eventually trapping itself to become an osteocyte. And osteocytes trapped in this little space, they can't multiply either. So the only source of new bone cells are the osteogenic cells multiplying on the surfaces. Then they become osteoblasts, then they become osteocytes. But osteoclasts can be made from those same stem cells that are found in bone marrow. They're not going anywhere. No, wrong one. Here we go. And so you can make more osteoclasts, but generally you have a limited population of them right now, and you can increase their activity by stimulating them with hormones. Alright, so those are the cells. Now let's take a look at the stuff that's in between the cells, the bone matrix. Okay. The osseous tissue, whether it be spongy or compact, right, is about 1/3 organic matter, and that's primarily collagen fibers, and 2/3 inorganic matter, which are the calcium crystals. The organic matter includes the collagen and some protein carbohydrate complexes. The inorganic matter is about 85% hydroxyapatite. So let's see, where's the hydroxyapatite formula? Yep. Okay, so let's just expand that momentarily. Oops, nope, cancel. Stop that. There we go. Slideshow, current slide. Alright, so a little bit bigger. Okay, it's better. So here's hydroxyapatite. 10 calciums, 6 phosphates, 2 hydroxides. That mineral is, that molecule made with calcium and phosphate ions is what crystallizes around the collagen fibers of osteoid tissue to become bone. Right? Too far back. So, whether you're looking at solid compact bone or spongy bone like the stuff we're seeing here, right, then you've got collagen fibers organized in a spiral by your osteoblasts, and then they become calcified with hydroxyapatite. That makes about 85% of the inorganic components, and also a few other things like calcium carbonate, which is what makes eggshells hard, and small amounts of magnesium, sodium, potassium, fluoride, sulfate, carbonate, and hydroxide ions. And so the whole thing is a composite with polymer components, which are the collagen fibers, and ceramic components, which are the hydroxyapatite crystals. With this combination of components in the matrix, your bone is now rigid, but flexible. You can take a bone and bend it slightly, right, so that it doesn't shatter immediately. if you took a pane of glass and tried to bend it, it wouldn't take many degrees of flexion before the thing would snap. Same thing for, say, for example, an icicle. You can't really bend an icicle, because icicles don't have collagen fibers on the inside to allow for that flexion. So if you took the collagen out of bone, it would become excessively brittle. If you were to take the hydroxyapatite crystals out of the bone, it would become softer and no longer rigid. In fact, you'd actually bend it like a rubber bone, and it wouldn't snap, but it wouldn't be able to support any weight. So that's why we need the combination of both to get the benefits of bone tissue: the collagen fibers plus the hydroxyapatite minerals. Okay. And when all is said and done, your compact bone and spongy bone, for the most part, end up being organized into these cylindrical columns called osteons. Okay. One osteon is made of concentric lamella. So let me just go to a larger view. Here we go. So here we have one osteon. Right? These rings of bone between here and here, and then here and here, and then here and here, and here and here, each one of those is one lamella. It's like the word laminated. It means layers. Right? So a lamella is just a layer of bone matrix that has been put down around a central canal. Okay? So the central canal is also sometimes called the haversian canal, and the lamella are connected to one another by all the canaliculi, the little fissures that run between one cell's lacuna and the next. But when you take a look at bone from the side view once again, like this one, then you see that's not just haversian canals. Haversian canals do run along the long axis of the bone, this way. But these ones that run transversely, those are called perforating canals or Volkmann canals. But does indicate that your compact bone is highly vascular. It's got blood vessels, both arteries and veins, and even has some nerves running through it too. So if you break a bone, it will bleed, and it will hurt a lot too. Okay. Let's see. About half a liter of blood per minute passes through the skeleton. Blood vessels and nerve enter the bone through nutrient foramina on the sides, like this one right here, okay, and open into the perforating canals that connect with the other central canals. Inner and outer boundaries of dense bone are arranged in circumferential lamella, like these right here. That are running parallel to the bone surface. Whereas if you're between osteons, then you also find sometimes lamella in here that maybe have a triangular appearance between the cylindrical lamella, and those are called interstitial lamella. So it's solid all the way through. The only spaces you're going to find are the spaces that the cells live in, and the Volkmann canals and transverse canals. Sorry, Volkmann canals and haversian canals. All right, but let's take before we finish, take one more look at spongy bone. So, all right. Spongy bone consists of a lattice of delicate slivers of bone called trabeculae, right? And also spicules. The difference between them is minor. Spicules tend to be more cylindrical bars of bone, whereas trabeculae tend to be more like wider plates. So let's just enlarge that one. Okay. So this would be one spicule right here, and here would be another spicule. But a trabecula generally is, I said, a broader plate of bone, even if it does have holes in it. So spicules and trabeculae. Okay. And spongy bone is covered by endosteum, permeated by spaces filled with bone marrow. Spongy bone does impart strength while adding a minimum of weight. Its trabeculae are arranged along the bone's lines of stress. So that's demonstrated here in this image. Okay. The purple lines and the red lines show that if you're putting weight on your bone, say for instance you lean over to one side or another, then the spongy bone on the interior is aligned to help bear that weight and deliver the weight to the thick compact bone that are in the sides of the diaphysis. Okay. So the point of this is that spongy bone is not grown randomly. It's grown in relation to mechanical stresses. Wherever there's more stress, more bone is going to grow, and it's going to grow in such a way as to support the weight that's being applied to it. Okay. And then, I guess the last part, bone marrow. Your bone marrow resides inside of your bones. Again, flat, short, long, irregular. But spongy bone areas are the places where you're generally going to be finding a lot of your red bone marrow. But red bone marrow is limited in the adult to your flat bones, irregular bones, and the heads of your femur and your humerus bones. So in other words, right here and here, those are the heads of your humerus and your femur. And then the flat bones of your ribs, your sternum, and your skull, and your hip bones, those are all going to contain red bone marrow, as are the ribs. The others, if they've got spaces inside of them, whether medullary cavities or spongy bone areas, it's going to be filled with yellow bone marrow, and that is primarily adipose tissue. Right? The red bone marrow is going to be the source of all of your formed elements, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, and because of its ability to make blood, it's called myeloid tissue, M-Y-E-L-O-I-D. Right? And the red bone marrow even actually counts as its own organ inside of your bones. But in the adults, let's see, the long bones and the other ones that we didn't mention so far are filled with yellow bone marrow, which is adipose tissue, essentially energy storage, more fat. Right? Let's see, yellow marrow no longer produces blood, except in cases of severe or chronic anemia. So if you're anemic, you haven't got enough oxygen in your bloodstream. So then, yellow bone marrow could go through metaplasia and revert back to red bone marrow, so as you could make more red blood cells and bring your blood oxygen back up to normal and hopefully alleviate the anemia. Okay, so that's been going on for, I guess, about 3 minutes. I think it's time to stop. And I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.